in general, for monetary policy, over the monetary policy horizon is the stance of fiscal policy. We take the stance of fiscal policy as given, and then we optimize monetary policy around that. This forecast is consistent with the most recent budget of the last government. As I indicated in my comments, there is persistent fiscal drag in this forecast, just as there has been over the last several years. That's one of the headwinds that weighs on the economy. It's one of the reasons why the path of bank rate, when it does rise, is likely to move at a gradual pace and to a limited extent. The other point I would make in terms of overall policy is that there are a host of policies and decisions, both within the United Kingdom and abroad, that influence the productivity of this economy. And what you start to see in this forecast is the constraints of slower productivity, slower supply growth on the pace of the expansion of the United Kingdom economy.
Sorry.
Can I just follow up on Richard's question? The last time the government came into power with a quite aggressive fiscal consolidation programme 5 years ago, there was a marked fall in the growth rate of the economy over the subsequent 2 years. What's going to be different this time?
Well, it depends on the path of fiscal policy, which depends on the decision of the government. As I said to the last question, we've incorporated the fiscal policy of the last government. The question is how the new government adjusts policy, and to the extent to which those are adjustments within a broad fiscal envelope, in other words, different spending and tax priorities within a broad fiscal stance, or there is a shift in the actual fiscal stance. As the monetary authority, we will take fiscal policy as given. We'll adjust our forecast with fiscal policies that are tabled in the House, not a series of comments that are made in the course of an election campaign. So we'll adjust when there's an actual budget. Sure.
The reason I asked is because there were £25 billion worth of spending cuts in the Conservative Party manifesto, £13 billion worth of departmental cuts and £12 billion worth of welfare cuts. And the Prime Minister has said explicitly that that manifesto will be implemented in full. So I'm quite surprised you're saying that you haven't yet taken that into account in your forecast.
Larry, there were, in all cases of all parties, but let's take the party that's forming the government, there were also spending commitments in their manifestos and in their comments. So the question is which cuts are implemented, which spending commitments are put in place, any adjustments, any other adjustments to the overall fiscal stance. Instead of speculating on what might happen, one waits in a relatively short period of time for the subsequent budget of the government and adjusts accordingly. I think what we know sitting here is that the broad stance of fiscal policy is restrictive, as it has been for the last several years and is likely to continue for the next several years. And that has a broad brush consequence for the stance of monetary policy in order for us to achieve the inflation target. But I think you'll understand this, there's no point trying to assess in an incomplete manner what might happen in a relatively short period of time when we will have all that information and can adjust our forecast accordingly.
David.
David Smith, Sunday Times. Governor, I'd like to ask you to elaborate on your comments on the equilibrium interest rate. Were you saying that thinking on the MPC is evolving on what the equilibrium interest rate might be when the headwinds from the crisis drop out? In other words, that the new norm may not be as different from the old norm, or was it just a message to the markets that the markets don't seem to be taking on board what existing thinking was on the equilibrium interest rate?
Well, let me break this into the equilibrium interest rate and markets, because there's two elements, and obviously ultimately they should come together, but there can be long periods of divergence. The first thing to say about the equilibrium interest rate, you know this, but I think it's useful to go through the context, is our view, and it was consistent with the stance of policy and it's consistent with the performance of the economy, was that that equilibrium rate went wildly negative during the course of the depths of the crisis and the immediate aftermath of the crisis, which is why my predecessors instituted a large quantitative easing program, other asset purchase programs, to get effective interest rates to a negative level, if I can use that shorthand, to get them below that equilibrium interest rate. With time, with repair of the financial system, that policy increasingly effective, and I would suggest that we are still in a position that the effective interest rate in the United Kingdom is below the equilibrium interest rates. That's why, in general, the economy is growing above our estimate of potential growth. That's why spare capacity is being used up, and that's why, over time, inflationary pressures will begin to build. That's a good thing. That's what we want. We want the economy moving back towards the equilibrium. We think that many of the headwinds which kept the equilibrium rate down, which kept it effectively negative, are dissipating, but some of them are not being eliminated. Okay, so the difficulties at the core of the financial system, those are largely going away, largely gone away and are going away. Banks have recapitalized, they have more liquidity. You see it in credit surveys, you see it in access to credit for small and medium-sized enterprises, clearly for households. The access to credit, particularly secured credit, is at record low. Those are going away. The weakness in foreign demand, the relevant foreign demand for the UK, has lessened, but it hasn't gone away, and we don't expect it to go away over the forecast horizon. We still have UK-weighted foreign demand slightly less rapid than historical averages. Okay. Fiscal, which we've talked about this morning, fiscal drag continues there over the forecast horizon, and again weighs on equilibrium interest rates. And I'd suggest as a last point, which is more of a prediction than a fact at present in markets, is that with time we will see higher intermediation spreads in financial markets. Some of the consequences of developments of liquidity in markets, which some of which can be expected, is that those higher liquidity costs will be passed on to borrowers, and that will keep equilibrium interest rates lower than they were in the past. So the sum of all that is we think that the rate is rising, that it will continue to rise over the forecast horizon, but it won't go back to historic levels. We can't give you, I won't be able to give you a precise point estimate either of where the rate is today, where it will be 3 years' time. We can tell something, though, about the behavior of the economy given the stance of policy and the fact that, in our view, the economy is going to return to slightly above trend growth rates, means that we do have a stimulative stance of policy, notwithstanding the strength of sterling and other factors. That's equilibrium interest rate. Turning to financial markets, there's a variety of factors that influence bond rates in the UK. Some of it is an estimate of exactly what I've just been talking about. Some of it is, much of it is a spillover from global bond market conditions. We've seen in the course of the last several months a marked influence of conditions in European bond markets that have weighed on yields in the United Kingdom. Some of that is reversing now. So I think at a point in time, and I'll finish here, is that you can't take a direct mapping from bond markets to where we think the equilibrium interest rate is.
Robert? Yes.
Yeah.
Sort of a couple of things, really. One was, given how unbelievably lackluster productivity has been in terms of revival over the past few years, how worried should we be that you've downgraded your expectations for growth in productivity? And has there been any work at the Bank of England to assess the possible impact on growth of business uncertainties created by the EU referendum?
Let me take the last point. I'll introduce productivity, then I'll hand to Ben to supplement, if I may. In terms of let's call it political uncertainties in general. So uncertainty about the outcome of the election, which would encapsulate potential referenda questions. What we persistently picked up in our agency visits, in our bilateral conversations with businesses, in broader surveys, you would have seen the same surveys, is that there was an awareness of this uncertainty, but what we were guided was that companies were not acting on that uncertainty. I should actually make that a double negative. They were not acting on that uncertainty, so it hadn't influenced yet investment plans. Now, we think in the end, with revisions over time, and that the data will broadly support that. So we do take that as broadly being accurate. So we are looking at this, and we'll continue to look at this very closely because it could be an important determinant of the forecast. As with time, there's greater clarity about the timing of a referendum, the question, the prospects, all those issues, as that starts to come into the public domain, it will be relevant. Let me turn to productivity. In terms of the shortfall, our marking down in productivity, I would emphasize a couple of things. One is that we have done more work on these so-called compositional effects, which so it's the nature of jobs and it's the nature of people filling jobs. So some of these jobs are lower productivity, low-skilled, low-productivity jobs. So that, and we've had a disproportionate number of those. That's a cyclical phenomenon that weighs on productivity. First point, and it's detailed a bit in the report. The second thing is you get people who are new to jobs who are not productive as they are with time. And again, as you in an upturn, another cyclical factor. So those people will become more productive. And so some of that weight we think is going to come off the productivity performance and the statistics. We've decided, our judgment, we could be wrong, but that this effect is going to last a little longer than we thought previously. That was one of the things we took from the supply uptake. But then you get to more fundamental or other determinants. We think that there's an element here of the slowness in recycling capital from low productivity to high productivity firms. Some of that could be because of forbearance, partly a result of the interest rate stance. Some of it is because of lower investment in the past, less capital deepening. And the question is whether there are other intangible factors that could be influencing, but why don't I?
I think that the Governor has touched on all the main points. You're right, it's been disappointing, particularly over the last year or so during the recovery, the last 2 years, when normally the cyclical pattern would be for productivity growth to pick up. And also for that reason, any forecasts we have are bound to be tremendously uncertain. And as the Governor says, it's our biggest single uncertainty probably over the forecast. I do take some encouragement from the work we've done over the last 3 months, if only at the margin, that it's reasonable to expect some growth, i.e. some pickup in growth and productivity over the next 2 or 3 years. One, because of the importance, we think, of these compositional effects, which are likely to be temporary. And also, I think there are some signs, if only tentative signs, of the increased churn in labour markets and also increased business formation that might aid the kind of reallocation that the Governor was referring to. Now, these are no guarantees at all that productivity growth will pick up, but they make me at least take a little encouragement, and I think it's reasonable to expect therefore some acceleration in productivity over the forecast period.
Chris, and then Ben.
Chris Giles from the Financial Times. Just to go on on productivity on the theme, I think roughly this would be the 30th inflation report in a row where the Bank of England has been disappointed with past productivity performance and then expect it to recover in the future. There is the definition of insanity is expecting something to happen, expecting the same thing to happen again and again. What evidence is there that you're right this time, and what is the consequence that you might be wrong?
Let me start with the second, and I'll go back to the relatively sane Dr. Broadbent. I think the consequence, there's a couple of consequences you can anticipate. One is it goes ultimately to living standards, slower growth in living standards over time for everyone in this